Hey, and welcome to another episode of Cult Life with me, your host, Robin Jackson. Thanks for joining me again this week. This episode, I discuss and review the books that I read when I started having doubts about the Jehovah's Witnesses, and these books actually help me to see the commonalities within the different organizations and cults. Now, these stories in these books reiterated my suspicions and my doubts about how these groups operate and how they keep people within the group and how their fear tactics and the mind control actually works. Understandably, many of these books and the nature of these books are off limits to people within these groups and are either banned from being read or labeled as apostate material. But they do reach the critical thinkers and those who begin to doubt the beliefs and practices of the individual groups. Now, the first book I would like to speak about is a book called Living at the End of the World, Humanity's Obsession with Its Own Ultimate Demise by Marina Benjamin. Now, this is a fascinating book. I actually stumbled upon this book while I was walking through a second-hand book exchange way back when I was, looking to read up on different groups and just to read up on stuff outside of the Watchtower organization at the time. And I stumbled upon this book. It's a fascinating book. It's a look into the history of the Christian Christian millenarian concept. The bizarre idea that the world as we know it will end, abruptly, with believers receiving paradise and the rest of us tribulations, which are too awful to mention. Got a bit tongue-tied there. Well, Ms. Benjamin points out this narrative that refuses to die. This book was published in 1998, so it was just before the year 2000, and we all know just before 2000, 1998, 1999, the whole hype around Y2K, and of course, some groups were punting the end of the world, and this narrative was around at the time. And she says in her own words, she says, "Can we tap the secrets of the future? And if so, is religious prophecy or rational prognosis the more reliable guide? When I wrote this book, I wanted to know why, when we're so clearly in the middle of things, we routinely imagine being visited by the end." So this book, this lively inquiry into humanity's obsession with its own ultimate demise, she revisits the brooding and righteous world of the apocalypse, where a lot of our darkest nightmares threaten to burst into the realms of reality, so to speak, whereby the lucky few will be vindicated or saved, while the rest of humanity gets to suffer eternal damnation and punishment. And she mentions that the Jews banished the apocalyptic books from the Bible. And it was only after the birth of the Christianity and the Jesus cult that these books re-emerged into the Bible's narrative. And then she speaks of the whole obsession from Patmos to Waco, the Reformation to the French Revolution, Joanna Southcott's virgin birth to Joseph Smith's empire building, to Heaven's Gate, the Hollywood-style suicide pact that happened there. And interestingly enough, she mentions in one of the chapters, the chapter is called The Prophetic Clock. She touches on the Jehovah's Witnesses and their, sacred arithmetic. Now, those of us who have been Jehovah's Witnesses, will understand when we talk about sacred arithmetic. The Jehovah's Witnesses, the Watchtower Society has always tried to justify and work out with complex mental gymnastics the end times, so to speak. But she goes back into the history of the organization and looks at the obsession of the Watchtower, as early on as Charles Taze Russell and his predictions, right down to 1975. And still today, the obsession that the Watchtower and the Jehovah's Witnesses have with Armageddon and the end of the world, so to speak. And she touches on that, and she goes into detail about the history of the Mormon Church as well. She talks about Joseph Smith and his deception and how he came to build. It started the Mormon Church and the Mormon religion. So it's an interesting book. It's called Living at the End of the World: Humanity's Obsession with Its Own Ultimate Demise by Marina Benjamin. The second book I want to concentrate on is called The Church of Fear: Inside the Weird World of Scientology by John Sweeney. Now, those of you who might have listened to episode 15 of the show, I interviewed a former spokesperson for Scientology in South Africa, Ryan Hogarth, and we touched on some of the practices of the church and his upbringing in the church. So Scientology has been in the news quite a bit recently with Leah Remini's Aftermath series, and of course the Going Clear documentary, and so to speak. But this book by John Sweeney, The Church of Scientology, almost destroyed the career of John Sweeney. He's a BBC reporter. He's an award-winning journalist, and he investigated the church for more than half a decade. And during that time, he was intimidated, spied on, followed, and results, were spectacular. Sweeney lost his temper with the church's spokesman on camera, and I think you can still find that clip on some of the social media platforms like YouTube. But the Church of Fear actually gives you a great insight into how the church operates. Sweeney tells the full story of his experiences for the first time, and paints a devastating picture of the strange organization, from former Scientologists who tell heartbreaking stories of the families torn apart and lives ruined, even to current followers who say that it is a solution to many of mankind's problems. Sweeney spends little time analyzing the actual tenets of the Church of Scientology, but he's more interested in what the church does to its members and with its members' money. He says, "I am not a timid man, but I was afraid then, and I'm afraid now. Afraid of them and afraid of it," he begins. "I fear that by even attempting to write this book, I risk ruin." So, he was scared. When he wrote this book, he infiltrated the church. He was right there in the upper, echelons of the organization. He met some of these people, and he has been branded as genuinely evil by current Scientologists. He was followed in cars and on foot and intimidated in a way that would have scared, the most hardy of us. In the past, those who have been, have sought to expose the iniquities of Scientology, and notably former members, have been given a very hard time. I myself have spoken to former Scientologists here who'd rather stay quiet and go about living their lives, quietly and not speak out or get involved in any activism, because they know what the church actually does. And it's been exposed, in a lot of series and documentaries now. So this is the real story of the church by a reporter who was brave enough to take it on. The next book that I found interesting and fascinating, a very fascinating read, was called Leaving the Saints, One Child's Story of Survival and Hope by Martha Beck. Now, this book is an amazing story of the daughter of one of the most prominent Mormon apologists, Hugh Nibley. And she discusses some of the horrific events of her childhood, her strained relationship with her father, and her tenure as a professor at Brigham Young University. It's important to note that this is not a trashy anti-Mormon book, although some Mormon members will certainly perceive it that way. It's not an expose of Mormon temple rituals and the inner workings, nor is it necessarily an effort to discredit the church, but rather it's an account of a woman who was a victim of child abuse and the difficult position she found herself in, as the daughter of such a well-known and respected member of the LDS Church. Martha Beck is certainly critical of the church, and to say otherwise would be misleading. However, one can hardly imagine that someone who had been through the experiences that she has would leave the church without some bitterness and anger. But in a thoughtful and moving and inspiring memoir, Martha chronicles her difficult decision to leave behind her Mormon childhood and upbringing, and reveals her lifetime struggle to overcome a dark secret buried within her childhood. While growing up as Mormon royalty, I put that in inverted commas, within the church, she was raised in a home that was frequented by the church's high elders, some of the apostles, as they call them, and her existence was actually framed by the strict code of conduct at the time. We know that her son was born with Down syndrome, and she and her husband left their graduate programs at Harvard, to return back to Utah, under the support of Mormon community. But after Martha began teaching at Brigham Young, she saw firsthand the church's ruthlessness as it silenced dissidents and masked truths that contradicted its beliefs. And most troubling of all, Martha was jolted into recovering memories of sexual abuse at the hands of one of the church's most respected leaders. The book is filled with great insight, and Martha uses humor at times, and she has an entertaining wit about her writing. And it's an unforgettable autobiography that offers a rare glimpse, inside one of the world's most secretive religions. But while also telling a profoundly moving story of personal courage and survival. So that book is called Leaving the Saints, One Child's Story of Survival and Hope by Martha Beck. The other book I want to mention, and of course as a former Jehovah's Witness, is the book called Crisis of Conscience by Raymond Franz. Now, I was a Jehovah's Witness for 25 years, and I remember all the rumors back in the early 80s, that were told about one of the governing body members that had been disfellowshipped for apostate tendencies and so forth. And you were told some half-truths and lies at the time. And now, since, of course, I've left the organization, and I found this book to be very honest, straightforward. It was a straightforward account of the inner workings of the governing body of Jehovah's Witnesses. And Raymond Franz, he's never vindictive or hateful in the book. And I feel at times that, he feels sorrow over the loss of friends and family and would have preferred a different outcome. It's an excellent book for anyone who wants to have knowledge of the Watchtower. And, as I said, it goes into the history of the organization as well, in such a way that, anyone can easily understand its roots and how it came to be where it is today. So Crisis of Conscience presents a story of a struggle to prevent the erosion of, a man's freedom of conscience and the dilemma of choosing between loyalty to an organization or religion and his personal, freedoms and, so to speak, his loyalty to his God. Very interesting book. I highly recommend it for those who want to know more about the history of the organization and how this book actually caused a big stir within the Jehovah's Witness community at the time. The last book I actually recommend is a book called 1,000 Lives. It's the untold story of hope, deception, and survival at Jonestown by Julius Shears. I'm not sure if I'm saying the surname correctly. Now, there have been many books written about, Jim Jones and the People's Temple and the massacre and the tragedy at Jonestown in Guyana. But 1,000 Lives actually follows the experiences of five People's Temple members who went to Jonestown. They speak about their experiences, how they got drawn in, and you'll notice it's very interesting that each of these members will speak about how they were drawn in for different reasons. It's not all the same. Their thinking was not all the same. One member said that they appreciated Jones' message of racial equality. The other one wanted to help the less fortunate. The other one speaks about how he hated Jones' church but was forced to attend services and moved to Jonestown because his parents were members. So it chronicles the lives of these five people and their experience with the whole Jonestown incident and how they got drawn in, and of course the tragedy that occurred after back down in Guyana at the time. So these books actually, I recommend them. They're very interesting books. They in my opinion, they actually show you the commonalities and the tactics that are used by many of these groups to keep people in. The experiences are similar. As you read these books and you come from a similarly high control group or a cult, you can actually relate to these stories. And you can feel the authors and their struggle and their pain and their crisis of conscience, their crisis of conflict within their minds, the cognitive dissonance at times, and how it plays out amongst these authors. Very interesting reads. I will put the links to the books in the show notes. I must say up front that these are affiliate links, so I do get a commission if you buy through those links, just to make it clear. But I just felt that I needed to discuss these books that helped me in my journey, coming out of the group, coming out of a high control group, that helped me to see that, there are other people out there in other organizations with similar issues, with similar struggles, and how they eventually coped with it. And my experience was not dissimilar to theirs. So that's the show for tonight, and I'm glad you could join me. I will, as I said, put the links in the show notes. And until next week, have a good one. Bye for now.